As artists, often what we want to do is create worlds, to imagine and manifest living, breathing realities on the page. But there's often challenges involved, especially when it comes to characters and your environments and making sure that everything kind of doesn't just look the same. You can have the same way to draw a tree, you can have the same way to draw a face. It works once, but if you want to create a living, breathing world, you often need to create variety. And you often need to do this in a really organized way. You need to understand visual design language. This is all about communicating clearly to our viewers, to the people who are looking at our art, reading our stories, and getting involved in what we're doing. A fundamental building block here is, through visual design language, being able to create variety, but doing so in a really conscious way. You can think of this simply as having two objects, two rocks. I might want to make it clear that these two rocks are the same. They're obviously unique, different shapes, but they're the same type of rock. But I also might want to say that this is a third rock and it's completely different, that it's built in a different way. It was created through erosion or the movement of the earth in a geological way in a completely different manner. Having the tools to slice and dice these different ideas is really, really important. And the same concept applies to everything that we design. All of our characters, all of our environments, all of our props, all of our objects, all of our ideas. Being able to, through visual design and through visual design language, separate out and create massive amount of interesting variety in your world is one of the things that will make it feel living and breathing. It's one of the things that will make it feel real. So what I want to do in this video is go over this concept of visual design language just in a really basic way so that you can understand how this stuff applies to the designs that you create. And I'll look at a couple of really basic examples, things like kind of trees, because that's a good way for us to get our head around it. And then I'll look at how this might apply to designing characters and how you could think about creating similarities and differences with your cast of interesting characters that you create. As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just you and me. This is real time. You can think of it more as a casual conversation or a traditional kind of lesson or class. We're going to look at visual design language and how you can kind of apply it to your personal projects. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. Just quickly, before we jump in, I just want to say that this is one aspect of what makes good design. I think it's one of the building blocks that is going to be fundamental to you creating your own worlds. And I think especially if you're not a character designer or you're not studying design explicitly, some of these things might not be obvious. They certainly weren't always obvious to me, but these are the things that we do every day as a concept artist. I've spent a bit of my career drawing comics professionally in the French market. I've also spent a bit of it as a concept artist in video games, feature animation, etc. And a big part of what I'm interested in though is like how to look at building our own worlds for our own projects, your own comic books, where often you don't have a lot of insight, an oversight of what the things that you're creating are actually going to look like, and it can be really hard to know how to apply a lot of those concept art tips and ideas to your personal projects. So I'm really talking about this at a really high level, right? Like how do you just create variety and interest within your designs, within your scenes, within your illustrations? But this is one of those just pillars of design that's so good and useful to understand that you can basically apply to everything, even a single illustration. This is something that will allow you to create variety within the different sort of elements there. If you need contrast or you need similarity, just understanding that these are really practical skills, that this stuff is actually really simple and really easy, as is a lot of concept design ideas. It's like pointy shapes versus round shapes, contrast versus lack of contrast, how to make a bunch of enemies feel similar, like they're of the same group, but different and unique, feeling as if different characters are part of the same sort of racial, cultural archetype, but they're all different, that they have different functional roles within that society that's symbolically linked to what we would understand those roles to be. This is often just what we're doing as a concept artist, just slicing and dicing visual design language and trying to make sure that the world is clear, that there's clarity. But as I said, I think you can apply all these things to your personal projects, your illustrations, whatever it is, to just make it feel as if there's more variety and more interest. This is one of these things that I'm always trying to do, and it's something that we can always improve. So here I've got a bit of reference from a graphic novel that I created called Seven Pirates, and I'm going to use this just as an example of how we could think about applying visual design language to different things, and it'll just serve as a really easy way for us to kind of look at some stuff. And what I want to do is, I guess, extrapolate one of the challenges that I dealt with when I was designing the characters for Seven Pirates, which is designing a visual language for what pirates might actually look like and separating out those different things from other characters. And I think this is often the challenge that you're probably actually dealing with. But before we go there, let's actually look at this in a really abstract way that I think will allow us to kind of understand, right? One of the primary sort of problems that you kind of are trying to solve for with this, with creating variety and similarity, etc., is that you kind of don't want all your characters to look the same. You don't want all your environments to look the same. And you don't want this kind of repetition or sameness that can easily kind of plague artists. This is certainly something that, I still struggle with, right? I often just fall into habits and I'm like, oh, I kind of don't have time to design something new. So having principles here is actually a really good way to not necessarily have to completely design a character early on, but just think about the principles and the visual design language of why your different characters look a particular way. A really simple way of thinking about this is that you kind of need to look at the forest. You need to look at the big picture, the whole thing, how all these characters kind of relate to each other as you design each character or each tree or each rock or whatever it is in your world. It could be a science fiction world. It could be a sort of modern day, sort of typical world. You have to think about, like, what are all the things in that world? How do I kind of communicate with people? Because often your style might be really happy or really sort of grim, right? You're starting from a particular place, and we're using visual design language to create different emotions where things are more happy or more sad or more one way or more the other way. So again, think about this at a really high level as having to always pay attention to the design of the entire forest as you're kind of working on one little tree so that you don't accidentally make them all look the same. Speaking of which, I think trees are actually a really good way to understand this concept. If we think about the need to draw a tree or a forest, I think this is actually a really good place to start. So we can think of saying, hey, right, I need to kind of draw a tree, right? Like, what does a tree look like? Well, you kind of have, I guess, your kind of iconic, symbolic version of what a tree may look like, right? We sort of have trunk, we have a foliage, right? This is our kind of iconic version of a tree, but obviously not all trees look like that. And I think the way to sort of think about this is to kind of say, like, what is a standard tree in this forest, and how do I kind of think about it? And a lot of this does come down to visual library of understanding the difference between what different trees or objects or rocks might look like. But if we kind of think about how we would think about, if we kind of explore how we would think about visual design language with trees, we get a really sort of easy insight into this. So we can think about this as being a tree, right? And what does a tree have? It has a trunk, it has foliage, and I can say, okay, let's create a tree that is similar to this, but different, right? And I could say, well, I've got a straight tree, and this is a type of tree, and you can learn a lot about trees that way. But I can also say, well, some trees are just more flowy, right? They don't grow straight up, right? And I could think about not necessarily needing to look at all the visual library of exactly what types of trees are a particular way. I can just use visual design language and sort of design my own tree and just say, well, one tree's straight and this other tree is kind of flowy. And I just kind of say, let's just use the visual design language to create a tree. And every time I create a branch, what am I doing? I'm saying, well, the design language of this is just nice, flowy shapes, right? And if I just follow that same design language, this is not a real tree. This is not a particular species of tree or anything like that. This is just, it's just me making different shapes. So that's a particular tree. And obviously we can look at how you would incorporate foliage into this. We could also think about, okay, let's do the same thing. I want to say, what would another tree look like? And I could say, well, let's use another non-straight tree, but instead of it being curvy, it could just be sort of jagged, right? So in this case, right, we're going to have much more sort of angular, creepy. This would be probably a tree that you would use on a symbolic level as being kind of more of a horror style tree. Or this could just be how you sort of represent everything in your style, right? A lot of people have styles where there are no curves, and a lot of people have styles where there are no straight edges. And this is where, again, from a design perspective, you need to be able to kind of slice and dice that and create separation and difference. But here, right, I can just have and say everything is a straight sort of line, right, or has this kind of exaggerated angularity to it. Right, boom. Now, these are all trees, right? It's not a rock, right? A rock might be like this, right? If it's me, again, I've often been criticized for drawing all my rocks round, right? It could be, a rock that's sitting in the ground. A bit of moss on the top, right? This is a tree. This is a rock. This is a tree. We know this because obviously they have similar anatomy, right? The trees are all trees. They all have a trunk, right? They all have branches. But I can create just very different looks and feelings by playing around with the visual design language. And the key here is to understand that I don't need to understand everything about the species of tree, the science of it. I can just use visual design language to be a really simple hammer that we hit this problem with, right? Just bang, bang, bang. Okay, now the trees look different. And we can kind of follow this along and sort of look at, okay, let's take a similar sort of concept of tree. I'll draw this one kind of these a little bit smaller so I can fit some of the foliage in and say, yeah, let's just go with our sort of flowy tree, right? I got flowy tree, right? And I'm also just going to say, okay, this has got standard tree foliage, right? Think about the overlap, right? The fact that you often don't see the branches, right? And I could obviously draw this much better and have a better result. Trying to keep this iconic and symbolic as much as possible, because again, it's easier to understand things when they're that way, right? But yeah, I might have this, right? And so we're basically combining this thing with foliage. It's like that. I could also take the same tree, right, and say, okay, let's have another tree here. And these are ideas that you would have as part of any sort of concept design class, right? And none of this is sort of new if you've looked at character design or sort of world design. I think the key thing to understand is that's sort of different here is how you kind of apply them to different tasks and to really look at what's going on here on a fundamental level. So you don't kind of just think, oh, that's just for character design, it's just for this, it's just for that. That we really kind of understand what's going on and you're able to kind of slice and dice things. Because often what happens is you you kind of have natural proclivities here, and you can design something that sort of looks cool. But then it'd be interesting. You draw a large project and you kind of find like, oh, you know what? Everything kind of still looks the same. It's often very challenging to get away from these sort of traps where you just have natural proclivities, especially if you're working in style, and it can be a lot harder to do this. So I think just having this at a baseline that we kind of do with everything is sort of really useful. Okay, so what I could do is just say, let's have more like sort of willow tree style leaves here. So I've got the same trunk, right? But very different visual design language for what happens with the leaves and the foliage. Boom. And just this is going to give us very, very drastically different feelings. So you can see that just by combining a couple of really basic ideas, you could create very, very different looks, very, very different feelings. And we're paying attention to simple anatomy. All these things are trees, right? They all have a trunk, they have foliage, but it's the visual design language of the trunk. It's the structure and visual design language of the foliage that will kind of make the difference. And just making small tweaks and understanding the feelings and the emotions that are associated with those on a symbolic level and being able to refine it and think about it will kind of help you a lot, right? If you can just sort of start to get this stuff happening in your art, it means you're not going to go to draw a forest and just kind of be like, and I often do this where I'm like, oh, it's all, right? It's all just straight trees. Every tree is kind of like this because I just forget that trees can be sort of different. And the other thing is that sometimes, and I think this is often where when you're looking at the idea of concept art is often where we as concept artists say, let's make a million different trees. Our job as concept artists is often to separate, and it'll be the level designer's job to create the forest, where often what they're doing is taking a million trees and kind of placing them there and creating variety and contrast by saying maybe it is like 100 straight trees, and then in the background, right, we can see there's a couple of like curvy ones. It's there that you're going to be able to create visual interest, that you're going to make people notice what's going on, and you're going to be able to create that kind of story of the visuals where you can create everything the same. If you just want this forest to fade into the background, if you have a little particular section, right, maybe people are, right, you have a little character, they're kind of walking along here and they just see, right, trees that are all the same visual design language, right? And you're just kind of saying, this is all the same. These are just background trees. You want that in most of the cases. You don't want people looking at everything being interesting. That's often the trap we fall into with concept design, where everything needs to be interesting, everything needs to be exaggerated, right? But maybe again, they kind of walk through that and they come to a glade and you have this kind of interesting, right, unique tree that has something special about it, something different, right? Something maybe looks a bit like this, right? All of a sudden we have variety and sophistication, right? So we've still got all those trees in the background, but here in a sort of special area, right, we have sort of something different. And so it's your ability to sort of combine these ideas, make things fade into the background with similarity, repetition. Repetition is still a great design principle, right? It'll always look good to have a bunch of trees that are just straight. But when you need to think about how to draw attention, how to make things look different, how to make things look unique, you can do it this way. And I think the key here is that if you think about this, it helps you to navigate issues of style and the way that you could maybe look at reference of a willow tree and kind of say, okay, what are the fundamental aspects on a visual design language level that separates a willow tree from a normal tree? And if you can really distill those into your style, then it just solves so many problems. So that's trees, right? And trees are a great example of many fundamental art principles, right? I think they're a good thing to practice drawing. When you're looking at drawing structurally and combining organic forms with kind of perspective and stuff like that, I really like trees as a demonstration vehicle. But look, that's often not what we're doing. What I want to do next is just a similar kind of demo to look at how you may design a cast of characters. In this case, I'll look at something similar to the Seven Pirates comic that I created, where we have to think about what is a pirate? How do I visually design a pirate, and how might you visually design pirates versus other people who are living on ships in the sea, and how to separate out those different ideas and think about how you communicate that by building your own visual design language into your project. So, what makes a pirate? This is where often we are dealing with stereotypes, archetypes, symbolism, and iconography. And I think often these ideas can be a little bit tricky to sort of get your head around, and it can be challenging if you kind of fall for the stereotype of thinking that all stereotypes are bad, right? The meta-analysis and the irony here is pretty deep. What is a pirate, though, right? We could kind of say that, if we sort of look at some of the pirates I've kind of drawn, the way I kind of solve this problem is to kind of make a lot of the pirates feel as if they often are a little bit sort of rougher around the edges, that they are a little bit more dirty, right? And that they are kind of like less organized than some of the other characters who are also essentially doing the same thing. Now, it's important to understand, if you look into the history of pirates, there's not often that much difference between your sort of pirates, your kind of privateers, your all these sort of different people who are basically all just floating around on boats, and whether you were doing the right thing or the wrong thing very much came down to whether you're sort of for or against the crown in that particular part of the sea, whether you have a bit of paper, whatever it may be. We, however, are dealing with a lot of the basic stereotypes, which is exactly what they would do in something like Pirates of the Caribbean, any of these films. Is we're really looking at utilizing cleverly and in a creative fashion a lot of stereotypes. So again, you can think about pirates as having a beard. You could think of them as being sort of disorganized. Right. Sort of messy. Because there is a chaos to the idea of the sort of the pirate life, right? Of these people kind of going out and making their own way in the world, of there being a different pirate code that doesn't necessarily follow a lot of the other more militaristic ways that people would sort of behave when they are on ships. We also have a lot of these ideas that they're kind of damaged, right? They're damaged yet alive. Now, a lot of people would have lost limbs on ships, right? It's very easy to get crushed by something, to something terrible to happen. And basically, if your hand got kind of, so you sort of have like kind of hooks, right? Right, you got your peg leg, right, hook. And even though this idea of sort of saying like, oh, okay, that seems ridiculous, right? That all these pirates would have hooks. So there's a couple of things there. Firstly, is like there's a lot of rigging. It's very easy for you to lose your hand doing something, and also you got to remember that if it got wounded a little bit, people are often malnourished on ships. They were often like in bad shape, and you basically just cut it off so you don't get gangrene. So a lot of the reasons is like if you get you stub your finger, gets mushed in some sort of rope or rigging or something like that. That often meant you just take it off, right? Because you don't want to get gangrene or anything like that, because that's it, it's game over, right? No, so I think that was probably how things were done back in those days. And the other thing is like you probably would put a hook there, because the hook will allow you to keep rigging and dealing with all these ropes and stuff like that. It's a very kind of functional thing to have on the end of your arm. So again, it's not quite so ridiculous as it might kind of seem. But anyway, we got a lot of these kind of tropes, right, and sort of stereotypes of like what a pirate would be. But again, I would often kind of you kind of look at the idea of, okay, we got like an eye patch, right? Because again, you could easily lose an eye, like anything bad happens, it's there's stuff flying all over the place. It's very dangerous being here. And yeah, there wouldn't be any of the ability to sort of get that fixed. right? So we've often got beards, right? Because people, don't have time to shave, or maybe it would be that, you would have your non-pirate sea people, and they would often have clean shaven. They'd sort of be in the military. They'd have all these kind of rules. So you kind of have this idea of the pirate life being about not having to follow all those rules, right? And just being able to sort of be human. And there's also just a way that a lot of these things make it feel as if it is sort of more rough, right, out on the sea, because it would have been. So there's a lot of these ideas, and this is where, again, from a visual design language, we're mixing in functionality, ideas. We're thinking about what are things that would sort of reasonably represent that idea to people, things that would sort of symbolize that, right? And one of the things you kind of have to think about, right? So if we're designing a whole book that kind of has, okay, we've got some pirates. So we've got sort of Jack Hyde here. Jack Hyde is your prototypical pirate. The pirate captain, the evil pirate captain. He embodies everything that kind of Blackbeard and all of these great sort of pirate captains are meant to be about. He's a little bit sort of more organized than the ruffians that are sort of under him. He has a lot of the visual iconography and symbolism of a captain, right? Being, having a coat. It looks like he doesn't get his hands dirty because there's a hierarchy on a lot of these ships where often, certain people do the messy work. Other people sit in the captain's quarters, right? And sort of strategize and think about what to do. And then you have sort of Gray, right? Who is a little bit in between, right? He, has a bit of both, right? So you can sort of think about adding the design language here, like we had with trees, where we can think about, like, how do I make sure that all of these people feel like a pirate, right? So we can have a pirate who's really sort of rough. We can have a pirate captain who is a bit more like Jack Hyde, who, it sort of still has some of these things. He has a beard. There's a disorganized aspect to him. He, sort of often has a lot of these sort of rougher, obviously non-sea captain, sort of militaristic sort of vibe to him. But, nevertheless, he doesn't sort of feel like a sort of just your standard on deck kind of pirate. So again, it's always a matter of sort of looking at and saying, okay, how do I separate pirates out, right? How do I draw another pirate versus how I would draw a sort of standard character, right? So here, if I've sort of got someone like sort of Jim Hawkins as a character, and I'll just sort of sketch him out because I don't want to go too deep into it, right? Boom. Right, so this is another character who is going to be in the world who is not a pirate, right? And we need to kind of separate this out. And this stuff is really basic. And this is one of the reasons why I'm picking this, right? Because it's really easy for us to kind of see how these kind of different ideas play out, right? So we got Jim. Oh. His kind of helmet hair thing going on. Boom. So I guess the next thing is to kind of think about, like, what are the visual design language differences between these, and how can we sort of apply them to create variation and similarity? So as I said, you have someone like Gray, who is a pirate-ish character, right? He was one of these people who is, morally ambiguous to a certain degree in the first book, right? I think he was always a fairly sort of stand-up character, but because Seven Pirates is an unofficial sequel to sort of Treasure Island, so a lot of these characters are existing in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and then a unofficial sequel was sort of dreamt up by Pascal Berthaud, the author, the writer on that sort of book. Right, so here I've got sort of Gray, right? He's got a longer nose. He's got, right, this kind of mustache here. And again, this is where he feels a little bit sort of in between, right? So he's definitely not a pirate, but he's also much more of an experienced seafarer than someone like Jim Hawkins, right, who is older but not quite as, right, not quite as experienced. So it's always a matter of sort of slicing and dicing, right? We're creating similarities, we're creating differences, we're creating visual design in a language so that people understand, so that people can get a good feeling for who these characters are on a visual level, right? So there we got gray, right? Boom. And then you might again say like, okay, well, how do I create more people? And how do I blend between them and kind of say, okay, what would you do to create a character who is a pirate, but maybe we can kind of tell visually if you want to, or maybe they're pretending to be more upstanding or less kind of rough, right? They haven't sort of diverted into this more animalistic archetype and stereotype that we kind of view the pirates through. But if we just kind of use this sort of thinking about trees as well, this is where, you know, I could design another pirate and just say like, you know, what are the basic sort of elements of a pirate, right? And I can say, well, we've got sort of interesting beards, right? It feels as if they're a little bit sort of rough, like they're kind of damaged, right? We could kind of have someone with a, right, broken nose or something like that. And if I kind of get this right, and I think about the design language of what a pirate is within my story, within my world, not within all worlds, not within everything, but just within my world, if I put on these iconic elements, right? The other thing they kind of often had was kind of earrings. Right? If I get this right, I should be able to create an infinity of pirate-ish people. And this is where you can play around with this and you'll kind of find, right? I'll be like, well, this guy, you know, he's feeling very, you know, this guy's kind of feeling very, a little bit more straight, right? A little bit more sort of organized. Right? Maybe we could give him some sort of broken teeth, right? To kind of say he's a little bit sort of rougher, right? Again, we're just sort of pulling on these levers. Again, make him feel a bit more sort of weathered. And yeah, just think about like what else could we do? And if we just kind of go back and think about and always just focus on like, what are these aspects, right? Disorganized and messy. If your character's not feeling as if they're similar enough, right? You know, think about what would make them feel more like this. And if you kind of create, again, a character that from a character standpoint is feeling, you know, a little bit more put together, right? You're not quite sort of vibing with it. It's just a matter of pulling some of these other levers, right? And saying, well, my design's not communicating on this level, right? But maybe I could, right? Maybe I could give this character just a bit more disorganization, right? Make it feel as if, yeah, he hasn't shaved. Maybe his, you know, sort of handlebar mustache and all that kind of stuff is like a little bit more interesting, right? Or we could say, again, you could fall into some typical sort of tropes and give him kind of a, right, a few scars, right, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, again, we're sort of moving through visual design to a much more sort of safe place in terms of that kind of stereotype. Now, again, when you're creating really unique, sort of interesting characters, you're often really trying to dial this in, but often also you have a whole bunch of background characters, right? And this is on one of these tasks, right? I got to draw like 20 people in the background fighting, right? Like, how do I just create, here's another pirate, here's another pirate, here's another non-pirate. Like, what are the differences? What are the use the visual design language to just effortlessly create more trees, more cars, more everything else, right? And it's just through experimenting, through learning, through designing, through doing these kind of sketches that you will kind of find these things. And the same thing is true of everything, right? You can have visual design language of, right, cars. Well, can have a car where like, oh, okay, all these cars are kind of similar. I don't know what kind of car this would be. Right, got a car like that. Well, got a car like this. Well, right, stuff on the roof. Right, stuff on the back. Right, big bumper bar. Now we can tell that these are all cars because, right, they're all things with four wheels, and we understand, the iconography of a car. But through changing just a few differences, right, we can create subtle variations, right? And this is what it's all about. This is what you just need to do and think about all the time, right? And so much of this, again, if you are designing, right, it can be like, oh, let's design a similar little car truck thing. Boom. Boom. Right. But let's just give it a slightly different shape, right? Same thing, right? And I'll put a few of those little sort of tanks or whatever they kind of have under there, right? And then, yeah, maybe we'll just, right, make this one look slightly different. Right, it's the same, but it's a little bit different. And you might even just, literally be like, let's put another thing up here, or, let's have this one be carrying these things. And then you get sort of this infinite variety. And often it really is just a matter of understanding what's the same, what's different. We translate those things into a visual design language, and then we just tell a story with those visual ideas. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas about, firstly, what visual design language is as it relates to you creating a living, breathing world. How you might apply it on a really sort of fundamental level, how you might practice it, doing really simple exercises with trees like this, with cars, to just get your head around it. Once you kind of start doing this, you kind of feel there's a lot of power here. There's a lot of freedom, right? Once you can understand, okay, now I can make things look the same. Now I can make things look different. If you focus on what those iconic elements are, like a tree has, trunk and foliage. A car has like sort of wheels. It makes everything make sense. And it's often just a matter of getting these basics happening, slicing and dicing the differences, and then internalizing and learning what those different visual design languages are, that allows you to just effortlessly create a whole army, a whole forest, a whole, freeway full of the same things that look slightly different, or, to design something that looks drastically different so it really stands out. This is so often the thing that you need to do to create contrast. Yes, you need to draw the thing that's really important, that's what your story's all about, that you're so keen for everyone to look at, but often we don't understand that we need to draw the background. You need to draw a sea, again, a street full of boring cars, so that when you design your interesting car, that it really stands out, again, if that's what you need to do with your story. So I think this is such a valuable tool to understand how to use. This is one of the fundamental pillars, I think, of design. It's what we do all day, every day as concept artists, but you can learn a lot about how to apply it to your world. I think one of the big challenges for concept artists is we often don't spend enough time drawing boring stuff. And in order to really make the cool designs that you have stand out, you often need to place them in other things, in a sea of normalcy, so they really do sort of pop and jump out at people. And that's often how you tell better stories. So anyway, let me know what you thought of this one, whether this helps you think through designing for your own projects or other things. I think really here, the key is that when you see good development work for stories, for films, you kind of see all these weird sketches. And I think once you understand what the purpose behind doing sketches here and exploration is, It gives you a lot more to do with your sketchbook and do with that pre-production phase where you're really figuring out, how am I going to draw pirates? How am I going to draw people who aren't pirates but are still doing exactly the same thing? How do I slice and dice these different elements? How do I incorporate the visual library for, period costume or the functionality that you might need? How do you kind of combine all these things and make it so that you can easily tell the story that you need to for your world? Anyway, let me know if this one helped. Other than that, catch you around. Happy drawing.